Hello, my loves, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. So, this week I want to have a little chat about something called internal family systems. So, this is a therapeutic approach and this is a model. So, today's episode is going to be more of like a psychoeducation episode because this specific model and like theory that I'm going to talk about, and also like therapeutic approach to looking at different parts of self, is something that I actually learned in my own personal therapy. I had never heard of this before. And it is something that I have, done further reading around because I just found it so interesting. And actually, it helped me so much. Do you ever say, like, I just feel like there's different parts to me, or I just feel like there's, like, it's just two different voices or two different parts of me? Well, this can actually be like the reason why you feel like you have multiple versions of self. So when I discovered this, I was like, oh my God, like this makes so much sense. So I am actually going to share some, I guess just not even share, but like do an episode around this, because I think holding this in your awareness, these internal family systems, this model, when you hold this in your awareness, it really brings, again, a deeper level of awareness to self. It brings understanding to self. It brings understanding to part of those like different sub-personalities that you may spot within yourself. Because the thing is we all have these different parts of us. And I think, you get... When you think about sub-personalities, I don't know for you, but the first thing that comes up for me is almost like bipolar or multiple personality disorder, like really extreme clinical diagnoses of that word having sub-personalities. But actually, the thing that I think is interesting is the more that I do this type of work and really understand, I guess, like therapeutic theories and work with clients and have really in-depth conversations with clients, and the more I do my own journey, the more I realize that we have so many of these different parts of us, these different sub-personalities that come out, and they can work conjunctively together if something happens. So like a few of these sub-personalities can be triggered, or you can have some of these that come to fruition or come to the forefront and be a lot more dominant and like stronger in a sense. So it will just feel like it's one part of self coming out rather than multiple being triggered at once. And then obviously, like, I am a big believer that we have that core self as well. So it's just interesting how I really believe that we have so many different versions of who we are. I believe so many different versions in our psyche, so many different versions in our, even the conscious, the unconscious, the subconscious, all of these different like layers to us. It's so unbelievably fascinating. So the internal family systems is, like I said before, a therapeutic approach, and it's used to understand and work with the various parts of our sub-personalities that exist in our mind. So for me, obviously when I read and I do my research on, and I just like, what am I going to say, educate myself on all of these different theories, and I learn, I really like to bring it into my world and like my space and the space with the client. So it talks a lot around our mind, but I just honestly feel like we have all of these different parts of our soul, all of these different parts of our essence, our wholeness. I don't particularly think it's just the mind, but obviously when this theory came about, it was focusing on the mind. So these parts, according to the internal family systems model, represent different aspects of our personality and often have distinct thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So I remember personally, for me, when I was in therapy, I would say one thing and then I might say a different thing, like without realizing what I was saying, and they might have been contrasting or conflicting. And this is something that I notice come through in my clients so much. They will talk and the nuances are underneath the language, the undercurrents of what I'm picking up on, so subtly that they don't notice. But I spot how many contradictions can come through when we talk. And that's why again, talking just briefly about the somatic work, that's why bringing the somatic work in is so beautiful, because it really allows us to hold space for these contradictions, but not just process and take language as the face value. And often I will see, and I do this myself, and like an editing occur when somebody's talking. So they will go to say something and then they will edit what they're saying, or they will tweak the narrative of what they're saying. This is something that was spotted in my personal therapy, and these different like parts of my personality that were coming through. And this was a big one when I was struggling. So I've spoken about this before. When I was actually in California and I started therapy, was the most I've ever struggled, and the conflict back and forth was just too much for me to be able to process on my own. It was just so overwhelming. So there was these different parts of me that had different thoughts, emotions and behaviours. So it was all kind of like coming through me, and it felt like me, but it felt really different. I don't know if that makes sense. So one part of me really strongly wanted to stay, one part of me really strongly wanted to go. And it was interesting because it wasn't as black and white as just make the decision. It was really, really complicated and complex. And then core self was just buried underneath all of this back and forth of these sub-personalities. So for me, the way that I like kind of went on my own journey using this specific, like holding this approach in my awareness in my own therapy, was that you have the managers, the exiles and the firefighters, and then you have core self. And core self was so like drowned by all of these different parts of my sub-personalities that she didn't have space to come out, and there was no trust to core self. So actually what it was about doing in my own, and I'm going to talk through this in the podcast episode, but what it was about doing is giving those managers, exiles and firefighters space, spotting those, noticing those, understanding why those parts of self are there and what they want, what they need, or what they are trying to do to achieve, and then trying to operate from a space of core self. And the more I was doing this, it was core self that decided to go to Bali. It was core self that made the decision not to go back to California. So it really is, once you notice these parts of your personality and how they come through, you're really able to hold these different like emotions and behaviors and thought processes in your awareness, and then channel back to core self. Okay, so there are three main types of parts in this model: the managers, the exiles and the firefighters. Okay, so I'm going to go through like what each one is. So your managers, let's start with those. These are really crucial in how you manage and cope with challenging emotions, situations, and experiences, okay? So even thinking of that word managers, like I know something will spring to mind. If we think about word association, managers, what comes to mind? Exiles, what comes to mind? Firefighters, what do you think of? That almost like those things that you associate with those words are little insights to what these parts of self are trying to achieve and the purpose that they play. So managers, okay? Crucial role in how we manage and cope, and they are essentially our protective mechanisms that develop within our mind and our psyche to help us navigate life and avoid pain. So when you think about a manager in a shop floor, a manager will oversee everything and everyone to ensure that there's limited chaos, to ensure that everything runs smoothly, to ensure that everyone is working how they're meant to be, it's a good day. If anything does arise, conflict, it's the manager that will deal with the conflict. So that is what our internal managers do to help us navigate life and avoid pain. So the main purpose of the managers is to operate with the intention of safeguarding us from harm, both emotional and psychological. So again, if we think about it, how we manage and cope with challenging emotion, situations and experiences, okay? So they are the internal gatekeepers that try to control our thoughts, our behaviours, our interactions in order to prevent us from feeling vulnerable or experiencing painful emotions. So our managers are our protective mechanisms. Something that just come up for me then, reading back on these notes, is they are the masculine, that feels like for me the masculine, like those protective mechanisms in place, that part of me that is just so, what's the word I'm thinking of, just like wired to look for risk. You know, it's like always there as humans, like we're always sussing out situations, like we're just so, there's a word I'm thinking of, it's not animalistic, but it's like another word to do with our ancestors. So like innately wired, aren't we, to look for risk and to look for safety and connection and comfort and all of these different things. Well, it feels like that's what our managers do. So the main purpose is to maintain a sense of control, safety and order within our internal world. So our managers want us to be in our comfort zones. Our managers don't want us to feel vulnerable. Our managers don't want us to experience painful emotions. So if we think about that in real time, imagine you're going to do a risk, or you're stepping out your comfort zone, or you're making a big leap or a change, or you're investing in yourself. Your managers are going to come in, and I imagine that your managers are probably going to come in and be quite rational. You know, they're going to come in with that voice of reason of like, why do you really want to do this? Like, is this a good choice? You know, maybe you should look at your money management. Do you need to do this? Do you need to go out? You know, can you trust that person? All of those thoughts that you have, they come from our managers because they just want you to be safe. So what are the traits of the managers? So they show up differently in different people. So again, I invite you to just think and reflect on your own like self with these traits. Okay, so for me, my managers come in quite like rationally in California, actually. Like they were coming in and playing that role of, I want you to be safe and I want you to I don't want you to be vulnerable. And even though I was in a situation that obviously was causing a lot of uncertainty, my managers didn't want to add more to that. So essentially they were, you know, do you need to go? Do you want to go? It's unsafe. You're not going back to anything, all of these different things. So I invite you to think about how your managers could come through. So here are some traits that the managers can have. So they can lead to perfectionism, because they may push you to excel and achieve high standards in order to avoid criticism and failure. So your managers, again, they don't want you to experience this internal part of self. Remember, when we're saying your managers, it's you. It's just a part, a sub-personality in you that's coming out. So you don't want criticism and you don't want to feel failure. So your manager might push you to excel and have high standards. Critical self-talk. Your managers can be self-critical and create like a harsh inner dialogue that consistently judges you and evaluates a person's actions. So your manager can not only have that harsh inner dialogue for self, but it is something that can really, really be quite critical. Control and planning. So your managers might try to micromanage situations and plan meticulously to prevent unexpected or uncomfortable outcomes. Again, remembering back to the reason why the managers are here. Avoidance. This is a big one of the managers. Again, I noticed this massively with self. They might encourage you to avoid situations, people, or emotions that could trigger that vulnerability or pain. So your managers are doing everything they can to kind of keep you away from that and gatekeep that part of you that is vulnerable. So obviously a natural tactic that part of self is going to want to do is to avoid any situations or people or experiences or conversations that might trigger that vulnerability. So rationalization, again, like I said before, they provide logical explanations for why certain behaviors or choices are necessary to to maintain safety and stability. So again, if we think about this in terms of, I don't know, let's just say you have a desire to sign up for the retreat in Bali, your manager is going to be coming through with all of those rational reasons why you shouldn't do it. Okay, so that's because it wants to maintain safety and stability. So you doing something that absolutely disrupts the timeline is something that's going to cause those managers to come in and give you rational reasons why you should stay where you are, because it provides you with safety and stability. Also, apologies if you heard that phone call ring. I meant to mute my phone and I forgot. Oh. The next one, emotional suppression. So the managers, again, might discourage you from expressing any strong emotions. And, if you hear that part of you that's like, no, keep it together. Don't show vulnerability. Like, don't let your guard down. Don't get emotional here. That is the internal manager coming in. Because if you let those emotions out, it is that perceived vulnerability, isn't it? And the managers don't want you to do that. So dependency as well is another way. So the managers can lead to a strong need for external validation and approval because they fear rejection and abandonment. So again, if you think about it in terms of being in a shop floor, a manager wants the day to go well, and a good manager will want good feedback from customers. It will not want to have any conflict. It will not want to have any negative comments. The manager in that shop floor won't want complaints about staff. So it works in the same way. Like if we just apply it in that using that analogy, it's a really good way to help you understand the role of a manager, because if you think about it with use of that analogy, but then flip it and apply it to yourself, your own internal manager will fear rejection and will fear abandonment as well. And then if you add in all of these different layers, because we are so multi-layered and complex as humans, you also then add in, any abandonment that you've experienced, any times you've been rejected, all of those experiences that you've had, your manager is going to know that you've had that experience before and just want to do everything in its power to protect you from feeling that way again. So managers can offer protection, but what can happen with that internal part of self is the strategies that you actually put in place can be really rigid and quite limiting over time. If you have an internal manager that really wants to focus on control and avoidance, this can really lead to you having almost like a narrow range of experiences. And it can really hinder your personal growth because, again, let's take it back to the example of wanting to sign up for that retreat in Bali, you could really feel the pull to sign up to the retreat in Bali, and your heart could want it, your soul could want it. You could know that it feels edgy, but it's doable. But your manager is going to come in and try to rationalize you out of that, which means you're hindering your own personal growth. You're missing out on an experience that could be incredible for you. So this is like when internal managers can actually be a detriment to self rather than something that's working in a positive way to protect you and ensure that you're safe. So it's not to hinder your managers, because again, from my own experience, we can't get rid of parts of self. Like maybe I actually don't think you could. I was going to say maybe over like long term therapy, but what I actually think would happen is you just become way more aware of your internal managers. You'd be able to spot them, and your core self would be able to use your managers in a way that allow you to flourish and allow you to offer self-compassion and awareness on ways that they aren't helping you. So I would say it's about understanding. And it's about, if they are coming through in any extreme ways, like try to make it more balanced with core self, exiles, firefighters, but you want to be operating from core self most of the time. And core self will be able to spot when that internal manager comes in. So again, it's just about compassion for this part, really getting curious, like understanding the positive intention around your internal manager, and really just allowing like this part of self to loosen the control that they do have over you. So whether that's perfectionism, whether that's, seeking external validation, dependency, critical self-talk, avoidance, emotional suppression, really finding a balance with this part of self. So you can have more authentic self and you can emotionally heal, you can go on this journey. So that they are your managers. It's an interesting concept, I thought, and this really might resonate. It might not resonate with you guys, but I had not heard of this until my own personal therapy. And when I actually found out about this, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. Like, really makes so much sense. And also remember that you have to make it, like I've said, but make it relevant to you. So listen to this episode and go away and think about how these parts potentially play out for you, and what parts come through for your managers, your exiles and your firefighters, okay? So exiles are another part of the internal family system. So they represent vulnerable and wounded aspects of our psyche, and they hold memories of, past traumas, painful emotions, unresolved. So the purpose of the exiles. So these are part of our inner system, like I've just said, that carry the emotional wounds and the traumatic memories from the past. And our exiles often emerge in a response to distressing events or situations that were overwhelming or difficult to process at the time. So they are like the young and vulnerable aspects of ourselves that were hurt, that were scared, that were neglected. And the managers and your firefighters, which I'm actually going to go into, work to keep your exiles hidden and protected, as their pain can be really overwhelming to handle directly. So for me, for example, when I was in California, my managers were there. However, it was the pain from the exiles that was so overwhelming for me to process that, that is what I would explore in therapy. And even like in therapy, it took me a good few months to start to be able to connect to that pain and be able to process it in a way that felt really helpful, or even be aware of it in a way that felt manageable. When I was in California, because of various different reasons, I just disassociated and started to disconnect because it was too overwhelming for me to handle the sheer level of vulnerability and pain that was coming through from that part of self. Okay, so you will again be reflecting on your own experiences, and your own experiences will be coming to mind now in terms of your exile part. Okay, so the traits of your exiles, again, all of these can manifest in different ways. These are just some common traits and behaviors. So emotional pain. The exiles hold deep emotional pain, sadness, shame, fear, grief related to traumatic experiences, or related to experiences that might not necessarily be deemed traumatic, but that were highly overwhelming and just deeply, deeply painful for you to deal with at the time. So that part of you that has been through something and carries, that hurt, that pain, that deep sadness within you, that is your exile part. Avoidance of memories. So your exiles, when that part of you comes through, it might trigger discomfort, disease, distress. When we think about it in terms of trauma, and those memories start to resurface, which can lead you to avoid, disconnect, disassociate certain parts of those thoughts, maybe that whole experience in general, or those situations. So again, for me, part of my healing when I went to Bali was being able to really sit and hold the pain of the experiences that I had had, and the pain of that part of me that was there for so long, just with different things that were happening. that I never give space to. I never give space to my inner exile to actually be seen and to come forward and to speak from that part. So it's natural for you want to avoid intrusive thoughts. So unresolved and unprocessed memories from our exile part may lead to intrusive thoughts or emotions that arise unexpectedly. So again, I see this with clients that I work with, where when something hasn't been processed, those thoughts come back and they're really, really strong and they feel really intrusive. So intrusive means, or like how I conceptualize what it means, where you almost cannot control. They feel different from just like negative thoughts or just like, like critical thoughts. They feel like really, when someone's in your personal space or someone's like, you just feel uncomfortable when someone comes into a room. Like, that's how I conceptualize intrusive thoughts. Like, they come in, but they feel like they've hijacked your space. They feel like they're not welcome. They feel really heavy, really, really like unwanted. That for me feels like, from my experience of working with clients who have these intrusive thoughts, like they come in and things that usually work to distract you from negative thought or, silence that inner critic or avoid that inner critic. It just doesn't seem to work with intrusive thoughts. But again, think about your own personal experience with these types of thoughts. And also intrusive emotions. So this is not something that I see spoken about as much, but you can get like intrusive emotions as well. So the same where those like really heavy thoughts come in, those really heavy emotions may come in and it can just happen totally unexpectedly. Okay, so fragmentation is another. So your exiles can result in a fragmented sense of self. So what we say from this is disassociation, disconnected, where certain emotions or memories are isolated and hidden. Essentially, that is disassociation or disconnection, and they're kind of hidden and isolated from your conscious awareness. So that is when you see your exile is coming into play, and it's that part of you because it's completely isolated an event, so you don't have to face the pain of it. Limiting beliefs. So the pain and beliefs held by the exiles can influence your self-perception and create limiting beliefs around your worth and your ability. Again, we see this happen when trauma comes into play with clients, that internalization of, if anyone finds out, I'm so shameful, I should have done this, I blame myself. That's an example of where those, obviously they're more intense than just being limiting beliefs, but when clients come into me, and we start to talk through these things, they feel like limiting beliefs that come through around their self-worth. And then obviously when we get to the crux of those, we can see at times it's entwined with, a traumatic experience or some trauma that was felt. Obviously, we don't just have limiting beliefs from trauma, but if we think about the level of emotional pain that an exile will feel, that real, like overwhelming, deep sense of like distress or difficulty in processing, those levels of experiences that we have, they are going to cultivate some limiting beliefs around our abilities or our worth. So this, you might see this come through in relation to your career or your job. If you've had an experience or if you've experienced bullying, for example, you may see your adult self carry some of these exile parts that have, I guess, limiting beliefs around your appearance, your worth, who you are as a person. I actually, just saying that, remember when I had experiences of being, like picked on in school in sixth form, and just went through periods where girls were just really, really nasty, just really not nice to me. And I remember thinking it was a me problem. I've spoken about this before, but I remember crying to my mum saying, like, it must be me, it's got to be me. And that, now I reflect back, was my exile coming in, creating that limiting belief around, that internalization of, well, it must be me, my self-worth, my inherent self-worth as a person. So low self-esteem as well, we see it come through because the unresolved pain in your exile part can contribute to feelings of low self-esteem, self-doubt, and lack of compassion. So again, creating that, so in your development, in your healing journey, really creating a safe and nurturing environment where these exiles can be accessed and healed. It's not about ignoring. This is really essentially what we're doing in the healing process, is we're bringing those exile parts into space. And I'm actually just thinking of a session that I had with a client on Wednesday. Her exile part just came through and she sobbed. Oh, we done a somatic connection session and we connected to the breath. She must have been breathing for 5-10 minutes and this sensation started to come through and she just let go. And the pain and the depth of the pain that came out when she was crying, that was her exile part, having that space and feeling safe enough to be held in the expression of that pain and that emotion. And, that's really cathartic because then she came out of that. And then we started to cognitively process and use language and stuff. And you could see she looked exhausted, but she had released that built up emotion inside, which was really beautiful to hold and really, really, really beautiful and such an honor to witness. So when we really give our exile parts, a nurturing environment, it helps us establish compassionate and caring relationship with these parts of self, okay? And acknowledge their pain. So again, in my own personal journey, acknowledging my exiles and acknowledging her pain, acknowledging those deep, deep parts of her that felt injustice, that just wanted to be loved, that just wanted to be seen, that just wanted to be respected and valued. I'm really, really sitting with that part of self. And that wasn't easy, in that healing journey, especially those moments in Bali where I really had to sit with the depth of that pain. And in therapy, it wasn't easy, but it was absolutely worth it because, I think that's a part of why I've been able to come through that emotion and move past that experience, because my exile had the space that she needed. So as you release and as you process and you release and you acknowledged, when you start to integrate your exile part, you can have a greater emotional freedom, self-acceptance, and just a more coherent sense of self. Okay, so you can feel these emotions of pain. Maybe there might be parts that come up again, you may be re-triggered again, but it's not overwhelming. It's not to the point where you feel you activate your nervous system and you're right back up there. It just almost feels like a tender memory. It can do. Or obviously if it's trauma, it can come up and potentially be re-triggering, but you have the resources to be able to spot that exile coming through and just really hold space, really have compassion, really process and move through that emotion. And then, your exile feels held and seen. And that's gradual as well. It's I was saying this on a podcast I done this morning of it's not a sprint when we do this type of work. It really is a gradual process because it's all around cultivating safety in self, safety with facilitator, safety with space, feeling held enough where you can give your exile that space to be seen, that pain, that hurt, that shame, that trauma, those intrusive thoughts, those limiting beliefs that might feel uncomfortable to talk out loud. It's just giving those space, but they need to feel safe. So the last one that we're going to talk about is the firefighters. They are the third part of the internal family system. So they play the role in managing distress and preventing overwhelming emotions from surfacing. Okay, so your firefighters are quick response mechanisms. So imagine again a fire. What would the firefighters do? They would turn up immediately and try to put out the fire. This is what your firefighters do in this internal family model of self. So your firefighters are I've just said quick response mechanisms that try to put out the emotional fires that maybe, I love that term. I remember my therapist using that and I was emotional fires, that's so interesting because it just brought so much visual imagery for me. that might be triggered by the emergence of the exiles. Okay, so vulnerable and wounded part. So your exiles, when we feel them start to come up, boom, your firefighters will come in and try to manage those not coming up, okay? Your managers are always, they're like the lookout. Okay, so they're always on the lookout for any of these other parts coming up, always trying to keep you safe, because the managers know deep down there's the exiles. They know that there's these deep wounded parts of self. So what your manager is trying to do is to gatekeep, like no one goes in there. But if something does get through that or something is triggered, your firefighters, that's where they come into play. Okay, so they are putting out the emotional fires, which I love that. And the purpose of them is to manage emotional crisis and prevent you from becoming overwhelmed by intense emotions or traumatic experiences held by the exile. So again, that would be, for example, let's say you feel yourself getting triggered, but you're able to like bring yourself out of it. That's your firefighters. Let's say you feel yourself getting triggered, you're not able to fight that emotional fire and you get full-blown triggered, your exile is fully come off, okay? So they use like various coping strategies and behaviors. So again, the firefighters, even though their job is to like put out the exiles, it's not always in the best way that they do this. So again, in California, just reflecting on my own experience, I would distract and numb. Like I was just numbing completely for a period of time because I was too, like it was just too much for me. So I would be on my phone. Again, like remember I said I had periods where I disassociated. There was like, I just didn't want to get out of bed. I was just avoiding it again by like focusing on all of these other amazing things around me, anything to avoid, and avoiding conversations that needed to be had because I didn't feel safe to have these conversations. So that the firefighters can come through to distract you, to numb you, or suppress the emotions that are coming up by the exiles, okay? And it's often in an attempt to maintain a sense of control and avoid emotional pain. So again, as women, think about what are your firefighters, what are your exile situations, what is the part of you that is your manager. So this is how your firefighters, and these are traits of your firefighters, again, different for everybody, self-reflect, think about that. They can have impulsive actions, so they might engage in impulsive behaviours such as overeating, substance misuse, self-harm, self-destructive behaviours as a way to distract from your emotional distress, okay? Addictive patterns. Again, your firefighters can be the internal part of self that has these addictive patterns that play out. So dependencies, alcohol, drugs, people, sex, exercise, anything to like numb that emotional pain. So you will just find yourself caught up in these addictive patterns. And this is why when you heal the exile, when you bring these parts in, you are looking at reducing the impulsive actions, the addictive patterns, the avoidance strategies, all of these things that are so detrimental to self, okay? Avoidance strategies. The firefighters might encourage avoidance of situations or emotions that trigger distress, such as avoiding difficult conversations or isolating you. So when they feel that exile start to come up, they might isolate you. When your exile starts to get triggered in a difficult situation, avoid that conversation. Don't have it because it's going to trigger that exile part of you. Distractions, intense things to distract you, or just really consuming activities. I see this so much with my clients, so much busyness doing everything but also nothing, finding a million things to do to just avoid being with self. Activities, shopping, phones, watching Netflix, always being around people, always doing something. And even when people feel like they're on their own, so like I always say to people, there's a difference between going on a walk and being with yourself and listening to a podcast. Sure, do that, but when you're really, really present, you would go on the walk and not listen to the podcast, and you would ground and you would be aware of your surroundings and you would just be with yourself. So see how you can have two different walks, the same activity, And you might feel like you're with yourself when you're walking, listening to a podcast, but there's a form of distraction happening. So just again, check in with that. Like, can you ever just spend time on your own, not distracted? Like presence. Can you put your phone down? Can you not journal? Can you not read a book? Can you not listen to a podcast? Can you not listen to music? Can you just be for a moment or two and just feel into that? Fantasies, escapist fantasies. So I've spoken about this on my stories once around the fantasies that we create. But you can, and it was something to do with trauma, and I can't remember what it was, but those fantasies that are created, but then also we see that play out with over romanticization as a way to daydream and detach from the present and avoid the emotional, pain. So I think for me in California, if I reflect back, there was a fantasy around how it would look and how it would be living over there. And when it wasn't going that way, I just clung onto that fantasy, and clinging onto that, the palm trees, the sunshine, living in America, all of these amazing things, to clinging onto that fantasy was the thing that was helping me avoid the pain that I was feeling. And then self-isolation, as we spoke about, withdrawing from social interactions, isolating yourself to avoid the triggers. So when it comes to working with your firefighters in a compassionate and constructive way, so instead of trying to eliminate your protective mechanisms, what's a really, really good step to do is to explore healthier ways to manage distress and emotions while gradually creating space for the exiles. So again, this all kind of works in fluidity with each other. And when you start to heal one part, you also bring in these other parts. You will notice if you're in therapy or if you're doing any work on yourself, ask that person who's facilitating space for you, ask them if they've heard of this before, and ask them if they notice different parts of you that are coming through. Because my therapist very quickly picked up on when my exile was talking, my firefighter, my manager versus my core self, she would say, I've just heard exile come through then. And then, so that's where that editing was happening. My exile would come through, my firefighter would then immediately follow up with something else, and it would diminish me going into the pain of my exile. It's very, very intricate, but very interesting how we just naturally do this. So so if your space is being held for you, just see if the person who's holding space can pick up on these different tones and parts of you that are coming through. So when you learn to cope with emotions more effectively, you reduce impulsive or harmful behaviors, which is what I was saying before. And what you want to do is to work through those destructive parts of the firefighter you have to look at the exile. So what are they protecting from? So essentially all of this comes down to your exiles, really. So once you start to welcome those into space, you then understand and find, more constructive, healthy ways of having firefighters, because they're always going to be there. And then you take it a level up to the managers. So again, this is just something that I thought was so, so interesting. And just some ways that you can start to work on your own healing process. So just some ways that you can start to work with these different parts of the family system. Develop self-awareness. Externalize those parts. So instead of those being internal, give each part of you a name, label them to help you differentiate and externalize them from your core self. This creates distance, objectivity, compassion. It means you're able to engage with parts of self. So this is something I done. I would actually notice when these parts were coming in, and I would hold them in my awareness. My core self would hold these in with compassion. So I would bring them out into the external. Self-compassion, again, is another one. Engage in your inner dialogue. So start to conversate with your parts. Ask them questions to understand their intentions, their concerns and their fears. Again, something I done. When I was in my exile, I would drop in, I would speak to my exile. When I was numbing out, I would engage in that inner dialogue with the firefighter part of self. What are you numbing me out for? Why are you doing this? And and just engaging in that inner dialogue and seeing what's coming up, because I guarantee you will notice different parts and different things and different thoughts and emotions come through. It's so unbelievably interesting. Journaling, again, you can journal and write and explore these different parts. Mindfulness and meditation, and again, just self-care, self-love, inner nurturing with core self, and honestly, like doing the work. So having that space held for you by a therapist or a coach. So somebody who is really good at holding space, who's able to mirror back to you, who's able to notice these different parts of you, who's able to help you integrate these parts and also integrate back into core self. So it's just so you can be more like cohesive, self-aware, and just more like loving towards self. So yes, they were my little tips. So I hope you did enjoy this episode. It was, you know what, I was unsure whether to record this episode, but I just found it so interesting and so beneficial on my healing journey. And it's obviously it's a bit more like theoretical, but I hope I've explained how it actually plays out in our day-to-day lives, and how actually we take this theory and this model, and how it's easy for you to digest that into something that you're now able to go away and reflect on in your own journey. So yes, I hope you enjoy it. If you would like to work with me in any capacity, then I am fully booked for August, but I do have space to take people on for embodied psychotherapy and somatic connection sessions. So if this is something that you would be interested in, then please just fill out an inquiry form. I will drop it below, or you can send me a DM or send me an email. And I hope you enjoyed this episode so much. I would love to hear your thoughts and your feedback on this episode. And if you could leave a little review, that would be amazing. It takes 2 seconds, but it helps the podcast so much. So on that note, I'm going to go. I'm moving out of my house today because it's all systems go. Me and my boyfriend, as you've seen in the last email that I sent, got the keys to our new house, but we are not in it yet, but we have to move out of this one. So I don't know when I'm going to go for 2 weeks, but it's fine. So I'm going to go and pack and do that. And on this note, I'm going to go. So thank you so much for being here, and I shall see you next week.